Ah, dear friends, imagine this. Sun-baked lands, the golden domes of Jerusalem rising in the distance, and a wave of anger bubbling up from within. The year was 1187. A battle that changed the course of history was being written as Saladin Ayyubi's armies crushed the Crusaders on the Hidden Hill. Jerusalem, that holy city, the pearl in the heart of Christendom, the sacred relic of the Muslims, was now under Saladin's control. As the Western world was shaken by this news, one thing was certain: this war would not be the end. It was only the beginning. Church bells rang out across Europe. The Pope cried out in a powerful voice, "This is a call. Rise up to save the Holy Land." Kings, knights, and peasants heeded the call. While plans were being made in the throne rooms, people were gathering in the squares, shouting for war. This time, it would be no ordinary battle. This was a struggle that would test the strength of kingdoms, harden faith like steel, and change the course of history forever. But, dear friends, think about it. Who were the people at the heart of this campaign? How did the ambition behind Richard the Lionheart's sword collide with Saladin's intellect? How did not only weapons, but diplomacy, strategy, and a battle of wills take shape? We were only just beginning the journey. Stay with me for the answers, because history is waiting to reveal its secrets. Of course, my friends, I am now taking you back to the dusty roads of the past, to those unforgettable days that changed the fate of Jerusalem, a city steeped in blood and faith. The story I'm about to tell is not only a battle of swords and armies, but also a deep conflict of religions, cultures, and human history. Are you ready? Because now I'm taking you to the Middle East of the 12th century. Jerusalem back then, Jerusalem, that holy city, with a prayer on every stone and history hidden in every corner. Jerusalem, which the Crusaders took in 1099 and blessed with blood and tears, had been their pride for a century. However, this would change with the emergence of a leader who would change the fate of the Middle East. Saladin Ayyubi, this leader, whose name became a symbol of courage, intelligence, and compassion, not only among Muslims but throughout the world, united the Muslim world into a single fist against Crusaders. And it was in July 1187 on Hidden Hill that a battle took place that changed the course of history. Saladin had planned every detail of the battle. Thirsty and tired, in the scorching heat of the desert, the Crusaders fell to Saladin's trick. That day, on the Hidden Hill, the great army of the Crusaders was shattered. This battle was not only a victory, but also the key that opened the gates of Jerusalem to Saladin. Jerusalem. My friends, this city is so sacred that the blood spilled on it is as deep as the echoes of prayers. On October 2, 1187, Saladin conquered Jerusalem, but not with blood and brutality as the Crusaders did, but with wisdom, mercy, and peace. Saladin left the Christians in the city untouched, respected their places of worship, and hoisted the Muslim banners on the walls of Jerusalem. This event shook not only the Middle East, but also Europe. The Crusader kingdoms were now in the process of collapse. One by one, the Syrian principalities and castles in Palestine came under Saladin's control. The glorious Crusader kingdoms were now but a shadow. The European nobility could not accept this. And Pope Urbanus III, my friends, when he received the news of the loss of this holy city, his heart could not bear the pain. According to legend, he died of grief. Solemnity. His successor, Pope Gregorius VIII, was filled with rage and determination. He cried out to the Christian world, "Jerusalem is ours. We must fight to regain it." The Pope's call spread across Europe. Nobles, knights, farmers, and even common people raced to join this holy war. The squares filled with cries of "God wills it," heralding a new campaign. The Crusader banners were raised once more. This time, however, a greater challenge awaited them, because they were not only facing Saladin, but also fate itself. And so the seeds of the Third Crusade were sown. But my friends, who took part in this crusade? How did the heroes of legend become involved in this holy war? Will it be the strong will of Richard the Lion-Hearted, or another surprised name? Let's find out together in the next episode. My dear friends, when the news of the fall of Jerusalem reached Europe after Hittin, there was only one word that echoed in those great provincial houses and splendid palaces: Holy City. For the Christian world, the loss of Jerusalem was not just a military defeat, but a profound challenge to their faith. People knelt in churches and prayed in tears. Priests delivered fiery sermons to the crowds gathered in the squares. Across Europe, spirits were on fire, hearts burning for Jerusalem. Pope Gregorius VIII was mobilized to lead this holy cause. His call was a rallying cry that would unite not only the faith, but the power of Europe once more. The Pope called on all of Europe to mobilize to make amends for the loss of the Holy City. The people gathered in those magnificent squares carrying crosses and banners were deeply motivated by the Pope's fiery words. Those speeches. When the cry of "God wills it" rose to the skies, there was not a single doubt among the people. This war was seen as an opportunity to open the gates of heaven. But this new campaign would involve not only the people, but also kings and emperors. And this, my friends, is where the heroes of our story come on the scene. First, that majestic figure, Friedrich Barbarossa, Holy Roman Emperor. Barbarossa. What a glorious leader. What a strong will. One of the most experienced rulers of Europe, Barbarossa was known not only for the wisdom of his age, but also for the courage of his youth. Although he was 70 years old, he did not waver in his aim to liberate Jerusalem. He gathered his army of tens of thousands and set out on a long, arduous journey from Europe to the Middle East. The knights united under his banners, the soldiers and volunteers from all corners of Europe, gave this expedition a different flavor. But Barbarossa was not alone, my dear friends. King Richard of England, Richard the Lionheart, a monarch whose very name makes one's heart tremble. His swordsmanship and genius on the battlefield were legendary. Richard's commitment to this campaign made him seen by his people as both a leader and a hero. And at his side was Philippe Augustus II, King of France. Ah, the relationship between these two kings, although united by a common cause, their rivalry was deep enough to change the fate of the campaign at times. Now, however, they had put aside all their personal disagreements. They had to join forces for Jerusalem, for the will of God. Of course, my friends, an expedition is not just about soldiers and leaders. The economic resources, the logistical planning, this is the part that should be seen not as a story but as a masterpiece. The churches of Europe worked hard to raise funds for this campaign. Nobles sold their estates, merchants raced to supply war materials, even ordinary people wanted to be part of this great campaign by saving a few pennies and donating to the church. The calls of a dinar for the holy expedition that echoed through the streets of Europe at the time demonstrated the people's commitment to this campaign. In terms of logistics, everything from the food and water needs of the armies to the means of transportation was planned down to the finest detail. My friends, this is where we can see that war is not just about waving swords, but also about patience and skillful strategy. And when those great preparations were completed, the banners that had risen from the heart of Europe were ready to decorate the skies of the Middle East. But, my friends, every ruler, every soldier, every individual who participated in this campaign brought another story. But now I would like to ask you, how did the journey of these heroes to reach Jerusalem begin? What was the fate of Barbarossa? How did the rivalry between Richard and Philippe take shape for this holy cause? Let's find out the answers to these questions together in the next episode. my dear friends, let us go back to those glorious days. Three great leaders were preparing to set off from different corners of Europe on a journey that would change the course of history. It was a journey not only for the sake of territory, but also for the sake of territory for faith and honor. The story of each of them was a legend, and this great expedition began in those moments when the excitement in the heart of Europe turned into a concrete movement. Let us first turn our eyes to Germany, the land of lush rivers and majestic castles. Friedrich Barbarossa represented the glory of the Holy Roman Empire. Ah, my friends, Barbarossa's preparations were legendary. Despite his age, the moment he mounted his horse, he instantly filled everyone around him with courage. This man, who had seen dozens of wars throughout his empire, witnessed the rise and fall of kingdoms, was now embarking on the greatest journey of his life. As his army made its way from Germany to the Balkans, it faced not only enemies but also the challenges of nature: steep mountain slopes, deep rivers to cross, and the chaos that prevailed in the Balkans at that time. Without Barbarossa's discipline and leadership, this army would have fallen apart long ago. But no, my friends, this man was not only a soldier, he was also a leader of the people. Each of his soldiers was like a son to him. The hardships of Barbarossa's advance through the Balkans tested the courage of the campaigners. Minor clashes with the local population did not demoralize the army. On the contrary, these difficulties strengthened the unity of the army. Barbarossa's leadership was a torch that lit the way. But, dear friends, let us not forget that this was only the beginning. There was still a long road ahead, unexplored dangers. Now, let us turn a little to the west, to the windswept shores of England and France. Richard the Lionheart and Philippe Augustus. The departure of these two monarchs caused great excitement in Europe. Richard was England's hero, a leader who inspired courage and strength in his people. But, my friends, his fame in this campaign came not only from his sword, but also from his determination. Richard's preparations for the campaign were a great sensation in England. Prayers were said in his name in towns, squares, and harbors, and soldiers proudly carried their banners. Philippe Augustus was a different leader. Though not as flamboyant as Richard, he was known for his intelligence and strategic genius. France's royal army was characterized by discipline and strength. Philippe's quiet determination, combined with Richard's fiery courage, made for a great force. But oh, my dear friends, the rivalry between these two leaders was palpable from the very beginning of the campaign. Even on the day they left the ports, as the ships sailed out into the waves, there was a secret rivalry between the two. Who will be more successful? Who will achieve more victories? These questions would cast their shadows throughout the expedition. Of course, this expedition was meticulously organized not only on land but also at sea. Richard and Philippe's ships were sailing through the blue waters of the Mediterranean. Given the difficulties of the time, sea voyages could be dangerous even by land. Storms, pirates, disease, but the disciplined preparations of these leaders protected their armies despite the dangers. Sea travel was not only a matter of transportation but also of strategy. Supply points, safe harbors, all carefully planned in advance. And so, my friends, these three great leaders finally began their campaign. As they marched towards the holy city of Jerusalem, they had no idea where their destiny would take them. The banners of Europe were flying in this great movement across land and sea, but the road was long and full of dangers. Would Barbarossa's army be able to cross the rivers and reach Anatolia? How will Richard and Philippe's alliance shape this great campaign? And is Jerusalem really waiting for them? Let's meet in the next episode to find out the answers to these questions. Ah, my friends, I have told you that history is not only made up of triumphs, but also of tragedies. This is perhaps the most heartbreaking moment of that great campaign. While witnessing the power of a glorious leader, we will also see the cruel face of fate. Let us now take a journey to the harsh lands of Anatolia and the sad shores of the Göksu River. When Friedrich Barbarossa, that glorious leader, successfully crossed the difficult terrain of the Balkans and reached Anatolian lands, he had a great journey behind him and an even greater unknown ahead. However, the heat and harsh geography of Anatolia was slowly wearing down his army. Those lands, my friends, were neither the cool forests of Europe nor the harsh mountains of the Balkans. Here the heat took one's breath away, and finding food and water was a great struggle. Barbarossa's army had to fight both nature and enemy attacks. Yet, Barbarossa's leadership kept his army's resilience alive. His presence instilled courage in the hearts of the soldiers. Tired soldiers remembered their own strength when they saw their commander's powerful presence. But fate, my friends, had prepared a different fate for him. And this fate was waiting for him in the cool waters of the Göksu River. That day the hot weather covered Anatolia like a blanket. Barbarossa and his army were preparing to cross the Göksu River. The river lay before them like an obstacle. Its deep waters, although refreshing, were full of danger. Barbarossa, as leader, wanted to be the first to cross. Ah, my friends, his courage always came from being on the front lines. But this time things went unexpectedly wrong. The emperor lost his balance in the river waters and disappeared in the strong current. The soldiers waiting on the riverbank watched in horror as this terrible event unfolded. The army was almost frozen. When they realized that their leader was no longer alive, the strong and determined army was shattered in an instant. Barbarossa's death was not only the loss of a leader, it was the loss of hope. Morale among the troops vanished with the current of the river. Some refused to continue the campaign, believing it to be a divine sign. Others were deeply grieved by the loss of their leader. The German army was never the same after this tragedy. Barbarossa's death broke the unity of the army and destroyed discipline. While some of the soldiers chose to return home, the rest continued their journey with a loss of morale. Not only a leader, but also a dream was lost that day on the banks of the Göksu River. But, dear friends, even this tragic event could not completely stop the dream of reaching Jerusalem. And what was the fate of the armies that continued the campaign after Barbarossa's death? What obstacles did Richard the Lionheart and Philippe Augustus face on their arduous journey to Jerusalem? Could they really retake the holy city? Let's meet in the next episode to find out the answers to these questions. Because the story is not over yet. The real struggle is just beginning. Ah, my dear friends, the story I am about to tell will take us to the heart of the Middle East, to the shadow of Jerusalem. But this time, we will turn our eyes away from the Crusader leaders to the Muslim side, to the glorious efforts of Saladin Ayyubi. The story of this great leader, determined to defend Jerusalem, is a saga not only of war, but also of intelligence, patience, and faith. Saladin began the work of turning Jerusalem and its environs into a fortress with the patience of an engraver, reinforcing the city walls, strategically choosing the places on the walls where the archers would be stationed, building the barricades. Yes, my friends, these preparations took days, even months. Saladin wanted every stone to be placed in its place with great care, because he knew that the defense of Jerusalem was not only a physical battle, but also a spiritual one. For him, Jerusalem was not just a city, but a symbol of Muslim pride and faith. But Saladin was not content with merely fortifying the walls. His real power lay in the plans in his mind. Known for his intelligence, he abandoned traditional methods of warfare against the Crusaders in favor of a more subtle strategy: attrition. Instead of engaging the Crusaders' vast armies in open battle, Saladin aimed to weaken, starve, and demoralize them. His aim was to make his enemy tired and fragile before the battle. And, my friends, he did this so well that by the time the Crusaders reached Jerusalem, they had lost most of their strength. Saladin's leadership was not limited to physical preparations. He was constantly working to keep the morale of his people high. At that time, the Muslim people of Jerusalem and its environs saw Saladin not only as a leader, but also as a beacon of hope. Every soldier, every farmer who spoke in his presence, when they saw the determination in his eyes, they put aside their fear and were filled with courage. Saladin instilled in his people the determination to defend Jerusalem. They heeded their leader's call and became united and united. But my friends, were Saladin's preparations for defense really enough to stop the Crusaders' advance? What would this great leader behind the walls of Jerusalem face when he faced the armies of Richard the Lionheart and Philip Augustus? And most importantly, how would the fate of Jerusalem take shape? Let's meet again in the next episode to find out the answers to these questions, because the great conflict has not yet begun, but we can already hear the restless winds. Ah, my friends, hold your breath, because now I will take you to the walls of Acre, walls built not just of stone and mortar, but of centuries of faith, passion, and struggle. Acre, a strategic jewel for both Crusaders and Muslims, a symbol of rising power in the heart of the Middle East. This city was the scene of one of the greatest showdowns of the Crusaders' third campaign. Crusader armies once again gathered from across Europe to confront Saladin. Led by Richard the Lionheart and Philip Augustus, this massive force marched towards Acre by sea and land. But, my dear friends, reaching Acre was a test for every soldier. The Crusaders had to traverse the harsh mountains and scorching deserts of Anatolia, crossing the obstacles that Saladin had so cleverly laid, one by one. Hunger, thirst, and disease haunted the armies. Nevertheless, when they reached Acre, they saw this city standing firmly in front of them. When the siege of Acre began, it turned into a chessboard. The Crusaders surrounded the city, huge catapults were placed outside the walls, archers were stationed on the highest towers. But inside, Saladin's men, emboldened by their leader, continued their defense with great skill. Arrows whizzed through the sky, while stones from catapults echoed against the walls. Acre did not even think of surrendering for a single day. The city, the strategic fortress that Saladin had guarded like a sieve, did not yield even for a moment during the siege. The Crusader armies constantly developed maneuvers to break the resistance behind the walls. Day after day, month after month, both sides were almost out of breath. In this bloody battle in front of Acre, not only soldiers, but also morale and strategy became important weapons. But the Crusaders were waiting for a force to boost their confidence, and it was at this point that two great leaders appeared on the stage in front of Acre. Now we come to the climax of our story. Richard the Lionheart, King of England, and Philippe Augustus, King of France, arrived among the soldiers fighting in the blood and mud in front of Acre. Richard was a leader who struck fear into his enemy every time he raised his sword on the battlefield. Philippe Augustus was a ruler known for his wit and strategic genius. The arrival of these two leaders in front of Acre was a morale booster for the Crusaders. They organized their armies, developed new plans of attack, and tightened the siege. But dear friends, the unity between the leaders was sadly short-lived. Philippe Augustus and Richard, though seemingly allies, were always fighting for supremacy. As the fall of Acre drew near, this tension came to the surface. Even small skirmishes between the soldiers of the two leaders almost turned into major conflicts. But at some point, all this tension would be forgotten in the shadow of a great victory. The Crusaders' attacks finally destroyed the walls of Acre. As the city fell, the Crusaders' cries of joy rose to the skies. But this victory had come at a heavy price. Acre was now in Crusader hands, but Saladin was still watching from afar. His wit and strategy were not yet exhausted. The fighting that resulted from this siege further sharpened the struggle between the Muslims and the Crusaders. And now, my friends, I must ask you, would this great victory have opened the gates of Jerusalem to the Crusader armies? Or will the genius of Saladin succeed in stopping them once again? Let's delve deeper into this story in the next installment and take a breathtaking journey through history together. And Richard the Lionheart is known as a warrior king, but his genius lay not only in his sword, but also in his strategy. When he ascended the throne of England, he saw little of his country, for his mind and heart were in the Holy Land, in the heart of the Christian world. Under his leadership, the Crusader armies, starting from Acre, attempted to recapture the lands controlled by Saladin. It was here that Richard's legend on the battlefield really began to take shape. In 1191, when he arrived in Ascalon, the city was not only a strategic stronghold, but also the southern logistics line of Saladin's forces. Richard's aim was not only to capture cities, but also to reduce his enemies' room for maneuver. His victory at Ascalon forced Saladin to retreat and was a great morale boost for the Crusaders. This victory once again demonstrated Richard's military skills and leadership abilities. However, This brilliant achievement was overshadowed by the unexpected withdrawal of King Philippe Augustus of France. Philippe's return deepened the cracks in the Crusader armies. Richard struggled to rally forces against Saladin, while at the same time trying to maintain unity among his own allies. This task was as difficult as the battle itself. Leadership disputes and conflicts of interest among the Crusaders weakened the morale of the army. But Richard managed to manage this chaos with his intelligence and determination. He proved himself a leader not only with his sword, but also with his mastery of diplomacy. His direct negotiations with Saladin were one of the most remarkable moments in this story. The fact that two great leaders had a dialogue beyond the battlefields shows how complex the political games of the time were. In these negotiations, Richard was looking for ways to reach an agreement with Saladin rather than challenging him, because he realized that the war could not go on forever. The respect the two leaders had for each other paved the way for peace rather than war. But could the borders drawn at the peace table always be protected on the battlefield? Richard's efforts to reorganize his army, combined with Saladin's tactical retreats, further complicated the situation on the battlefield. Divisions within the Crusader army and temporary truces with the enemy pushed the limits of his leadership ability. But Richard continued to fight with determination. The nickname Lionheart was a tribute not only to his physical courage, but also to his endurance in the face of such challenges. And now, my dear friends, the questions that remain in this struggle beckon us. How far would Richard's diplomatic moves advance his leadership? Which side would prevail in this strategic chess game between him and Saladin? Our story does not end here. This fascinating dance of war and peace invites us to the next chapter. Wait and see. How will this saga on the stage of history come to an end? My dear friends, sit down now and close your eyes and imagine. On the one hand, the golden domes of majestic Jerusalem looming on the horizon, and on the other, an exhausted but determined army advancing under a blazing sun that strikes fear into the heart. Jerusalem. For centuries, this city where faiths intersected was both a promise of paradise and a battlefield. But getting there was never easy, especially for Richard the Lionheart and his Crusader army. Led by Richard, this holy journey started with triumph and turned into an increasingly difficult struggle. The fall of Acre and the victories at Ascalon had boosted the morale of the army. Everyone felt that Jerusalem was almost within their grasp. But war was fought not only with swords, but also with nature, disease, and one's own weaknesses. It was these unseen enemies, rather than the battlefields, that determined the fate of this campaign. The scorching heat of the Middle East was the first obstacle that tested the Crusaders' endurance. Accustomed to the cooler climes of Europe, these soldiers were exhausted by the sun as they marched across the desert, and with limited access to water, they struggled to regain their strength. As the caravans of supplies and ammunition ran out, unrest grew among the soldiers, while eyes searched the horizon for the light of Jerusalem. Minds were preoccupied with food shortages and infighting. Hunger was an enemy that could bring even the strongest warriors to their knees. Then there was the silent progression of disease. Dysentery, malaria, and other epidemics swept through the army, decimating the Crusaders. Those who escaped the sword on the battlefield died fighting disease. Even Richard himself had his share of these hardships. His health would fail from time to time, but this brave leader always managed to rise again and stand in front of his army. Leadership was not only about giving orders, but also about being a light in the soldiers' most desperate moments. And Richard was unique in this, but as much as the challenges of nature, the complexities of human nature were also a factor in this campaign. The personal interests and ambitions of the leaders within the Crusader army weakened its unity. With the return of Philippe Augustus to France, the leadership of the Crusader army was left to Richard. Although this seemed to be an advantage, on the one hand, the jealousy and territorial conflicts of interest of other leaders disrupted the harmony within the army. While some groups wanted to attack Jerusalem immediately, others saw this attempt as suicide and demanded that logistical problems be solved first. These disagreements drove the army's morale even lower. As Richard marched towards Jerusalem, he was not only fighting external enemies, but also risking the disintegration of his own army. He had won great victories against Saladin, but at a heavy cost. Saladin was strategically trying to buy time. He was mobilizing his resources to defend Jerusalem and waiting for the Crusaders to weaken. Did Richard still retain the power to breach the walls of Jerusalem? Or was this an illusion? Although the dream of Jerusalem flashed in Richard's mind, strategic realities outweighed it. Conquering Jerusalem would only be the beginning. Capturing this holy city did not mean they could hold it forever. His army was already depleted and his resources limited. A prolonged siege or war with Saladin's army would have been a disaster for the Crusaders. Richard's leadership required a realistic perspective, and so the attack on Jerusalem was abandoned. This decision can be seen as both a defeat and a victory. The Crusaders had reached the gates of Jerusalem, but they had not achieved their goal. However, they managed to hold important areas such as Acre and Ascalon, and reached a peace agreement with Saladin. According to the agreement, Jerusalem would remain open to pilgrims, and visits to the Holy Land could continue. This was at least some consolation for the souls of the Crusaders. Now, my dear friends, think about it. Did Richard and his Crusader army really fail? Or did this hard-fought battle enable them to leave a greater legacy? And was this decision the end of Richard's story, or a harbinger of a new beginning? In the next chapter, we will open the final curtain on the saga of Richard the Lionheart. Did his legend end in a quest for peace away from war? Or did the cruel hands of fate meet him in another square? Wait and see. Ah, my dear friends, in the end, every great conflict ends, sometimes not with the stroke of a sword, sometimes with the ink of a treaty. The struggle for the Holy Land of Jerusalem has taken countless lives, exhausted armies, and pushed leaders to their limits. But the decisions made on the battlefield shape not only the land, but also the future. This is why the negotiations between Richard the Lionheart and Saladin Ayyubi stand out as one of the most impressive examples of diplomacy in history. Following Richard's decision to abandon the attack on Jerusalem, the Crusader army was disappointed. The soldiers, who had set out with a dream of victory, were only a breath away from the holy city and had to accept returning empty-handed. But Richard was about to show that he was not only a warrior, but also a master diplomat. The direct negotiations with Saladin were an arduous process in which both sides laid their limits, hopes, and fears on the table. Both leaders represented not only their own soldiers, but also the future of the Holy Land. Saladin was able to defend Jerusalem and keep it under Muslim control. This was both his military and moral victory. But the exhaustion that followed the victory also shook Saladin. For him, too, there came a point when peace was inevitable. Richard, on the other hand, realized that he would not be able to seize these lands outright, but he could not accept to return empty-handed. The mutual respect and intelligence of the two leaders produced one of the most remarkable treaties in history, the Treaty of Ramla. According to this treaty, Jerusalem would remain under Muslim control. This symbolized a victory for Saladin, but Richard received a guarantee that the Muslims would respect the freedom of worship of Christian pilgrims in this holy land. Christian pilgrims would now be able to travel safely to the Holy Land, say their prayers, and breathe in the spiritual atmosphere of Jerusalem. Although they did not physically possess Jerusalem, a spiritual connection was maintained. It was a compromise in which there was no winner of the war, but both sides tried to minimize their losses. My dear friends, to understand the terms of this agreement, we need to look a little deeper into the world of the time. Saladin and Richard, two great leaders, proved their superiority not only on the battlefield, but also on the stage of diplomacy. Saladin accepted the peace in order to preserve the unity of the Islamic world and the spiritual significance of Jerusalem. Richard, on the other hand, instead of returning to Europe empty-handed, guaranteed the safety of pilgrims and consolidated his spiritual leadership of his kingdom. The mutual respect between the two leaders was one of the most remarkable aspects of this peace. Saladin reportedly sent his own physicians to Richard when he was ill, and even gave him a horse to protect him from the cold. These gestures showed that humanity, justice, and respect could flourish even between two enemies. Saladin and Richard's wisdom in making peace is perhaps one of the most memorable moments in the history of the Crusades. And the result? Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands and Christian pilgrims were granted access to the holy city. But did this mean that the war was really over? No, my dear friends, it was only a short break, a respite. New plans were being made in Europe and new leaders were emerging in the East. With this treaty, Richard was forced to return to Europe. But was this his last battle? And what future did Saladin lead his people into after this peace? The answers to these questions are hidden in the rest of our story. Now I'm waiting for you in the next episode to dig even deeper. Have we really come to the end, or are we on the verge of a new beginning? Wait and see. My dear friends, now it seems that we have come to the end of one journey, but in fact it is only the beginning of another. The Third Crusade had come to an end. Richard the Lionheart had left the Holy Land to return to his native England, and Shah ad-Din Ayyubi set about restoring peace and order to his own land. But this great struggle had left its mark, not only on the battlefields, but also on minds and hearts. Let's take a look at the aftermath of this campaign and the legacy it left behind. Back in Europe, there was a great debate about whether the campaign was a success or a failure. While Richard's courage and military genius were widely praised, the failure to capture Jerusalem led to deep disappointment in some quarters. The papacy and the nobility debated whether the results of this campaign were enough for the Christian world. But no matter what anyone said, Richard's leadership and his victories had etched his name in the pages of history in golden letters. In England, Richard became more of a legend than a king, and songs and epics were filled with tales of his heroism. So much so that many began to see Richard as a messianic figure who would return to Jerusalem. But what about Saladin? My friends, his story was equally inspiring. For his wisdom both on the battlefield and at the diplomatic table, Saladin became known throughout the Islamic world as a hero and a unifying leader. His justice, mercy, and respect for his enemies inspired deep admiration not only among Muslims, but also among Christians. Many knights in Europe even saw Saladin's motto for their own principles. Shah ad-Din opened the doors to a new era in Muslim-Christian relations, creating an atmosphere of understanding and dialogue beyond war. The consequences of this campaign were not limited to the personal stories of the leaders. The Crusades were no longer just struggles for holy lands, but also a reflection of the complex relations between East and West. The Third Crusade established a new balance between Europe and the Islamic world, allowing the two civilizations to get to know each other better. The riches, wisdom, and culture of the East were brought to Europe by the Crusaders. Trade routes were revitalized and an interaction between different cultures began. But this interplay was also laying the groundwork for new conflicts and struggles. My dear friends, every story has an ending, but history never stops. After the Third Crusade, plans for new campaigns were already being made in Europe. While the papacy aimed to gather a larger army to recapture Jerusalem, the Muslims were stepping up their efforts to defend their own lands. Leaders following Richard and Saladin followed in their footsteps and developed new strategies and plans. But would those who followed these great leaders be able to maintain their wisdom and honor? That is another question for history to answer. Now, I leave you with a question, my friends. In the wake of Solomon and Richard, will this land one day enjoy true peace? Or were the Crusades a harbinger of new and greater conflicts? My dear friends, this great story called history is a fairy tale with neither a definite beginning nor end. Each era is the harbinger of another. Each hero is the shadow of the next. Today we traced the Third Crusade together, witnessed moments of heroism, and saw once again how history shapes human beings. But history is a mirror not only of victories and defeats, but of human desires, fears, and hopes. And what we see when we look into this mirror are not only traces of the past, but also clues to the future. Richard and Saladin. The story of these two great leaders carries a message not only for their time, but also for today and tomorrow. Richard's stubborn courage and Saladin's just wisdom teach us what it means to be human. But it is also a story of the suffering of war, of the destructive power of hatred between peoples and civilizations. The struggle for the Holy Land is a testament to how far human beings can go. However, this effort sometimes leads us to question what we have gained and what we have lost. Jerusalem was not taken, but the faith and devotion to that land was never lost. My dear friends, what remains after the Third Crusade is not just a series of events written down in history. It paved the way for the shaping of the future and opened the door to a new era for both East and West. Trade routes expanded, cultural exchange increased, but it also sparked new conflicts. But have all these efforts paved the way to peace, or is humanity doomed to repeat the same mistakes over and over again? I remember that every ending is the beginning of another story. The Crusades did not end, but rather opened the door to bigger and more complex events. How did the leaders who followed Saladin and Richard carry on their legacy? And how has history remembered the story of these two great heroes? Here, my friends, lies the great magic of history. Every answer becomes a new question. In our next conversation, as we continue our journey through history, we will talk about how both the East and the West have dealt with this legacy, the traces of the Crusades, and how humanity has navigated this great test. So I leave you with a question. Can history really make peace possible? Or is every peace born in the shadow of new wars? We will look for the answer to this question together at our next meeting. Rest now, but we always keep this question in mind because history always comes up with a new story. And here, dear friends, we have come to the end of our journey through history. Imagine what storms, what dreams, what wars humanity has weathered through the ages. Today we remember the epic, the triumphs, the tragedies, and the legacy of the Crusades, which were more than just wars, but events that left deep traces on the destiny of humanity. Different worlds, cultures, and religions came together, sometimes learning and growing in peace, sometimes separated in pain and bloodshed. Behind each expedition, there were people with their finger on the pulse of history, brave kings, brilliant commanders, peasants brimming with faith, and wandering souls who wanted to reach beyond their own world. And what are we left with at the end of this journey? Maybe the hope for a better world, maybe lessons to be learned, maybe just an amazing piece of our history. But remember, history is never just a tale of the past. The world we live in today has its roots in the soil of those times. Trade routes, cities, civilizations, even our identities bear the traces of the steps taken at that time. Now I ask you, what has humanity learned from all these events? Have we succeeded in building a more peaceful world? Or is the weight of this historical legacy still on our shoulders? Dear friends, history does not come to an end. It is like a river that is always flowing. We are small beings floating in this river. That is why we will continue to tell these stories to understand the past and build a stronger bridge to the future. Together with you, we will continue to shed light on the forgotten corners of history and discover the secrets of that old world. The next time we meet, I will be back with a new story, a new journey. Until then, my dear friends, don't forget to listen to the whispered secrets of the past and flip through the dusty pages of history books. Goodbye, and until next time, get ready for a journey through history.